The first thing I noticed when I pulled into my driveway was the absence of my car. For a moment, I just stared at the empty space where my black Mercedes-Benz S-Class had been parked. My brain scrambled for a rational explanation. Had I left it at the firm? Loaned it to a friend? No. I distinctly remembered pulling into my driveway last night, exhausted but victorious after 6 grueling months of legal combat in the biggest antitrust case of my career. And now, the car was gone. My stomach tightened. I stepped out of my rental, feeling the dry Arizona heat press against my back, and immediately spotted something else. Bright yellow notices plastered all over my front door. HOA violations. A creeping sense of unease settled in. I tore one off and skimmed the words. Vehicle in violation of HO Code 7.2b, excessive street parking, previous warnings ignored, fines. Accumulated $2,500. Vehicle has been repossessed to cover outstanding fees. Repossession? What the hell? A voice called from across the street. Didn't see you out last night. Tow truck came around 2 a.m. I turned. It was Jim, my retired neighbor who spent most of his nights chain-smoking on his porch, acting as an unofficial sentry for our cul-de-sac. Towed? I repeated, my voice sharp. He nodded, exhaling smoke. Catherine Jones was with them. She was giving orders. My fingers tightened around the notice. Catherine. I knew that name well. Everyone in Saguaro Crest did. Catherine Jones, our self-appointed dictator in beige capri pants, was the iron-fisted president of the Homeowners Association. She wielded bylaws like weapons, buried homeowners under absurd citations, and collected fees like a tyrant demanding tribute. She thrived on power, petty, small-town power, and now she had stolen my car. I wasted no time. Marching across the perfectly manicured lawns toward her house, I pounded on her door. Within seconds, it swung open, revealing Catherine herself, 50-something Botox-frozen smirk and the dead-eyed confidence of someone who believed she was untouchable. "Elliot," she said, feigning delight. "Back from your little business trip, I see." "Where's my car?" She clasped her hands together like she'd been expecting this moment. "I assume you read the notices?" "You had no right to tow my vehicle," I snapped. "HOA fines do not grant you the authority to repossess private property." Catherine tilted her head, that smug little grin still fixed in place. "You were warned, repeatedly, and you ignored the fines. That's a violation of our contract, which gives the HOA legal standing to recover unpaid dues through asset repossession." "Bullshit," I growled. Catherine tisked, shaking her head. "You should know better than anyone, Mr. Big Shot Lawyer. Everything I do is perfectly above board." I could feel my blood pressure rising. "You just committed grand theft auto, Catherine." She laughed. Actually laughed. "Call it what you want, Elliot. The fact is, your fines are paid now. I suggest you be more mindful of the rules moving forward." I clenched my jaw so hard my teeth hurt. "Where is it?" She gave a casual shrug. "You'll have to take that up with the impound lot." I took a step closer, lowering my voice. "You think you're untouchable, don't you?" She didn't flinch. If anything, her smirk deepened. "I know I am. Not for long, you aren't." I spun on my heel and stormed back home, my mind already churning. This wasn't about my car anymore. This was about control. She'd stolen from me to make a statement. No one defies her. But what Catherine didn't realize was that she'd just picked a fight with someone who never lost. I unlocked my door and stepped inside. The air was stale, the house eerily silent after months away. I barely had time to process it. I went straight to my office and powered up my computer. First, I pulled up my security footage, and there she was. 52 a.m. Catherine Jones, standing on my property, motioning to a tow truck like some kind of war general overseeing a battle. The footage was crisp, undeniable. She'd orchestrated this. I felt my pulse slow, my breathing even out. The anger cooled into something sharper. I had her, but I wasn't going to rush this. No, I had something better in mind. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number. "Elliot?" The voice on the other end was groggy. "Jesus, it's 2 a.m. What's going on? Wake up, David, I said. I need you to dig into someone. David Rowan, investigative journalist, old friend, a man who lived to expose frauds like Catherine. There was a pause, then the sound of shuffling. Who are we burying? I looked back at the security footage, watching Catherine's self-satisfied smirk frozen on the screen. A woman who thinks she's above the law. David let out a low whistle on the other end of the line. This is bold, even for a power-tripping HOA dictator. I exhaled slowly. She thinks she's untouchable. And you're about to prove her wrong. Damn right I was. I transferred the security footage to a flash drive, my mind already working through the angles. The footage alone was enough to paint Catherine as a power-hungry lunatic, but I needed more. A pattern. A history of abuse. One stolen car wasn't enough to bring her down, not in the way she deserved, and that's where David came in. Start digging, I said. I want to know everything. Past HOA disputes, lawsuits, complaints. If she sneezed in the wrong direction, I want to know about it, David chuckled. Now you're speaking my language. I ended the call and sat back in my chair, staring at the paused footage. Catherine had been careful. Too careful. She played the game like a seasoned bureaucrat, hiding, behind bylaws, weaponizing fine print. But people like her always get sloppy, always overreach. I just had to find it. The next morning, I paid a visit to the impound lot. It was exactly as expected. Sleazy, overpriced, and conveniently partnered with the HOA. The attendant at the front desk barely glanced at me before sliding an invoice across the counter. $2,600 to release the vehicle. I stared at him. The fines were $2,500. He shrugged. Towing fees, storage fees, processing fees. Catherine's racket ran deep. How many people had she done this to? How many had just paid the absurd fees to make the problem go away? I leaned in. You deal with Catherine often? His lips pressed together like he suddenly remembered a confidentiality clause that didn't exist. I just processed the paperwork. I didn't push. Not yet. Instead, I paid the damn money, reclaimed my car, and drove home, fuming but patient. This wasn't the battle. It was the opening move. By the time I pulled into my driveway, David had already sent me an email. Subject: You're gonna love this. I opened it. Catherine's name was all over civil records, small claims court, liens, HOA disputes. There was a clear pattern. She targeted homeowners who were either too old, too uninformed, or too busy to fight back. She drained them through fines, fees, and legal threats. Some had lost thousands, others had lost their homes, and no one had stopped her. My jaw tightened. I wasn't just going to stop her. I was going to destroy her. That night, I took a walk through the neighborhood. A few neighbors glanced at me, hesitant. Others averted their eyes. The fear was palpable. Catherine had made an example out of enough people that no one dared to cross her. Time to change that. I spotted an older woman standing in her front yard, arms crossed as she stared at a freshly planted red HOA violation sign in her grass. Her name was Margaret. Widow. Lived here for 20 years. What did she get you for? I asked. Margaret sighed. Landscaping infraction. She motioned to her yard. Same flowers I've had for years, but suddenly they're against regulation. And the fine? Margaret's face darkened. $1,800. $1,800. For flowers. I let out a slow breath. Margaret, what if I told you I could make this go away? She gave me a skeptical look. Catherine doesn't lose. She's never played against me. Margaret hesitated. Then, just barely, she smiled. And just like that, I had my first ally. Over the next 2 days, I dug deeper. I talked to more neighbors, listened to their stories, the absurd fines, the threats, the sleepless nights spent worrying over whether their home would be next. Catherine had built a system that thrived on fear and silence. She was about to learn what happened when both were taken away. Then, as if she sensed I was gaining ground, Catherine struck back. I woke up to find another yellow notice on my door. Violation, unsightly vehicle. Fine, $1,200, unsightly? My car was a Mercedes-Benz. It was a power move, a message. I know what you're doing. Stop. I grinned. Too late, Catherine. But she wasn't done. By noon, I got a letter from the HOA's attorney, a cease and desist, claiming I was harassing board members and disrupting community order. I laughed out loud. She was scrambling. Then came the final escalation. That evening, Margaret called me, her voice shaking. She's taking my house, Elliot. My stomach dropped. What? Margaret's breath hitched. She filed a lien. Said my fines have exceeded the limit. If I don't pay in full by the end of the month, she's foreclosing. I went cold. She wasn't just tightening her grip, she was crushing anyone who resisted. This was the moment she overplayed her hand, and I was ready. I grabbed my phone, hit record, and called Catherine. She answered on the second ring. You really should. Be more careful about the company you keep, Elliot. I kept my voice measured. You filed a lien against Margaret. She broke the rules. Bullshit, I snapped. You're extorting people. And I have the proof. Silence. Then, calm as ever. Proof doesn't matter if no one listens. And there it was, the moment she sealed her fate. I smiled. You're right, Catherine. I leaned back in my chair, my heart pounding. Good thing I found someone who will. I hung up and texted the recording to David. His reply came in seconds. Let's burn her down. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the message, heart pounding. This was it, the turning point. Catherine had played her hand, and now it was my move. David wasn't wasting any time. 5 minutes later, he called. I pulled every legal document tied to Catherine and the HOA, he said. And Elliot, this is so much worse than we thought. I sat forward. How bad? She's been running a full-scale extortion racket. You were right. She only targets people who are vulnerable. Old folks, single parents, people who don't have the time or resources to fight back. I clenched my jaw. I already knew this much. What else? She lied about the liens. David's voice was electric with urgency. She's been filing them illegally. She never reports them properly to the county. The moment someone caves and pays, she drops the paperwork before it's ever processed. There's no legal trail, nothing linking her to the scam. I sat in stunned silence. It was genius. Horrific, but genius. She'd been foreclosing on homes through pure psychological warfare, bluffing her victims into believing they were legally trapped, and no one had caught her. Until now. David, send me everything. Every document, every case. I want a full picture. You got it. A pause. Elliot, she's going to know we're coming. I exhaled sharply. Good. Catherine had spent years wielding fear like a weapon. Now, for the first time, she was going to be the one looking over her shoulder. My plan required patience, precision. I couldn't let Catherine know just how much I had until the moment I was ready to strike. So I played it cool. That morning, I took a leisurely stroll to my mailbox, coffee in hand, as if nothing was out of the ordinary. I even waved at Catherine, who stood across the street, arms folded as she watched me like a hawk. I could practically feel her suspicion. She knew I wasn't backing down. She just didn't know what I had. When I got back inside, I checked my email. David had delivered. Scans of fraudulent liens, emails between board members discussing unofficial tactics, bank transactions showing questionable HOA fund withdrawals. It was an avalanche of evidence, enough to bring criminal charges. I stared at the files, pulse thrumming. This was bigger than a lawsuit. This was a takedown. But before I could make my move, Catherine struck first. That afternoon, I received a lawsuit, Catherine Jones versus Elliot Grayson. She was suing me for defamation and harassment. I actually laughed when I read it. Desperation. She was trying to flip the script, make me the villain before I could expose her. A bold move, but also a fatal one, because filing this lawsuit meant she had just made everything official. Now she had to go to court. And when she did, she'd be walking straight into my trap. I had no intention of settling, no intention of backing down. I wanted this lawsuit to happen because it would give me the perfect stage to expose everything. But Catherine wasn't done yet. That night, the power cut out in my house. I checked the breaker, fine. The neighbors? All had power. I walked outside and found a brand new HOA notice taped to my door. Power suspended due to unpaid utilities. Bull. Shit. Catherine had called the local power company and faked an unpaid balance under my address. I pulled out my phone, ready to call and fix it, when I noticed something else. A black SUV parked down the street, tinted windows, not moving. I recognized it immediately. Catherine's car. She was watching, waiting for me to cave. I exhaled slowly, then smiled. Fine, Catherine. You want to play games? I texted David. It's time. 2 nights later, the HOA held its monthly community meeting in the clubhouse. A sleek, modern building meant for social gatherings, but mostly used for Catherine's power plays. Tonight, it was her battleground. The room was packed, more than usual. Word had spread. Neighbors who had never attended before were here, whispering amongst themselves. There was an energy in the air. Something was coming. Catherine sat at the head of the long conference table, back straight, hands folded, exuding an air of calculated control. I took my time walking in. When I did, our eyes met. She smiled. Smug, confident. She thought she was winning. Not for long. The meeting began. Typical nonsense. Budget reports, minor rule changes. Then Catherine leaned forward. There is one final matter, she said, her voice smooth, practiced. I'd like to formally address the disruptive behavior of a certain resident. All eyes turned to me. Catherine sighed, shaking her head in mock disappointment. Elliot Grayson has engaged in targeted harassment against the HOA board. False accusations, slanderous claims. This is not the behavior of a responsible homeowner. A murmur rippled through the room. She continued, voice oozing control. As such, I am requesting a formal vote for legal action. If the community agrees, we will move forward with a restraining order and necessary financial penalties. The murmuring grew louder. Catherine sat back victorious. All in favor. I stood. Catherine's eyes flicked to me, but she didn't stop speaking. Say, aye. Silence. Then I spoke. I have something to share before you vote. Catherine tilted her head. A silent challenge. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a flash drive, and just like that, the air shifted. The murmurs turned into hushed anticipation. This, I said, holding up the drive, contains everything the HOA has been hiding. Fraudulent liens, illegal financial activity, proof that Catherine has been extorting this community for years. The room went dead silent. Catherine's face didn't move, but I saw it, the flicker of doubt in her eyes, the microsecond of hesitation. I set the flash drive on the table. This is going public, I said. Right now. And then, for the first time ever, Catherine Jones looked afraid, but I wasn't done. I pulled out one last document, a printout of a very particular financial transaction. This, I said, placing it in front of her, is proof that you personally embezzled money from the HOA's emergency fund. Gasps, whispers, a ripple of shock. I locked eyes with her. You weren't just fining people, Catherine. You were stealing. Her face turned to stone. I leaned in. This isn't a civil matter anymore, I said, voice low. This is criminal. And just like that, the vote wasn't about me anymore. It was about her. Catherine stood up abruptly, knocking over her chair. Meeting adjourned. She snapped. She turned to leave, but the doors swung open. 2 men in suits entered. Detectives. And just like that, Catherine's game was over. The room went silent. Every set of eyes flicked between Catherine and the detectives standing in the doorway. She froze, her hand gripping the back of her chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. One of the detectives, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a badge clipped to his belt, stepped forward. His voice was calm, methodical. Catherine Jones? Catherine didn't answer. She swallowed, her lips parting slightly as if she were about to deny everything. But she hesitated. For the first time, she had no script, no bylaw to hide behind. "This is a joke," she said, forcing out a brittle laugh. This is nothing but a smear campaign by an angry homeowner who's upset that he got fined." I smiled. There it was, the last desperate play. The detective didn't flinch. "We have reason to believe you've committed multiple counts of fraud, extortion, and embezzlement." He pulled out a document, a printed warrant. "We have a subpoena for HOA financial records and transaction logs. Your personal accounts are also under investigation." Catherine's face paled. You can't just walk in here and—" "I'd be careful about what you say next," I cut in, stepping forward. "Anything can and will be used against you." Her eyes snapped to mine, pure hatred burning behind them. I had never seen her this unhinged before. This wasn't the composed, calculated woman who had tormented this neighborhood for years. This was a cornered animal, and she knew she was about to lose everything. "You smug little—" "Catherine." The detective's voice was firm, unshaken. "You have the right to remain silent." The second detective moved in, reaching for her wrist, and then Catherine did the unthinkable. She lunged. Not for the detectives. For me. Everything happened in a blur. Her manicured nails clawing at my jacket, her voice breaking into a guttural scream. I barely had time to react before the officers pulled her back, restraining her as she thrashed, her mask completely gone. "You think you've won?" she screeched. "You think any of this matters? You're just a pathetic lawyer who doesn't understand how the world works." The neighbors watched in stunned silence. Then Jim, retired, chain-smoking Jim from across the street, let out a low chuckle. "Damn," he muttered. "She finally cracked." That did it. The tension shattered. Murmurs turned into chuckling. Chuckling turned into outright laughter. Not nervous laughter. Relief. For the first time, the community saw Catherine for what she really was. A bully, stripped of her power. One of the detectives tightened the cuffs around her wrists. "Catherine Jones, you are under arrest." Her head snapped toward the room, wild-eyed, searching, but no one was coming to her defense. Not her board members. Not her so-called loyal supporters. She was alone, and she knew it. The detectives led her toward the door. She twisted once more, her voice desperate, almost pleading. "This neighborhood will fall apart without me," she shrieked. "You need rules. You need order. You'll see. You'll all see." And then just like that, she was gone. Silence stretched over the room. The power vacuum left in her wake was almost tangible. Then Margaret, sweet, mild-mannered Margaret, stood up. "Well," she said, dusting off her cardigan, "I suppose we'll need a new HOA president." A ripple of laughter followed, mixed, with cheers. The storm had passed, and for the first time in a long time, the neighborhood belonged to the people again. Catherine Jones was sentenced to 6 years in prison. The fraud charges alone were enough to ensure she'd never hold power over anyone again. The embezzlement charges made sure of it. And the footage of her attacking me? Well, that only helped seal the deal. Her assets were seized. The HOA funds were recovered and returned to the community. And the illegal liens? Every single one was voided. Margaret was elected as the new HOA president. Her first order of business? Rewriting the rule book. The community didn't fall apart. It thrived. No more arbitrary fines. No more extortion. And best of all, no more Catherine. I stood on my porch a week later watching as neighbors chatted freely. In their yards, relaxed, unafraid. Jim wandered over, lighting a cigarette. "You really did it," he mused. "Took down the wicked witch of Saguaro Crest," I smirked. "And I didn't even need a bucket of water." Jim chuckled. "Well, if she gets parole early, I still got my hose." I shook my head, glancing across the street where Catherine's old house stood, empty. A for sale sign had been planted on her pristine, rule-approved lawn. Poetic justice. I took a deep breath, the warm Arizona air carrying a sense of finality. Catherine had spent years building her empire on fear. But in the end, fear wasn't enough to protect her. She was just another fraud, another bully who thought she was untouchable. And now, she was nothing. I took one last look at the neighborhood, the place she had once controlled, and then finally I smiled. The reign of Catherine Jones was over, for good.